Hey there, students. We are continuing with the Salem witch trials. Now, this should be something that we are slightly solemn about because this is an actual event in Puritan history. It's an actual event in our American history, and many people died as a result of these trials. And as unbelievable as it is that this happened, it's true stories. And we're going to look at some of these things, and it's just going to seem like no one could possibly believe those things or go along with them. But sad to say, these are true events, and these are things that really did happen. So from June to September of 1692, 19 men and women were convicted of witchcraft and were hung. Another man was pressed to death. So this concept of pressing, okay, is actually very tragic. Okay, and so what would happen is they would dig a very shallow hole. And in this shallow hole, a person would be laid down with their arms stretched over their heads and in chains. Same thing with their body. Their legs around their ankles would be in chains as well. And then a board would be placed over their torso. Now, might take several men, it might take only two, but during this time, they would be taking and placing large stones. Okay, and they would be placing these large stones on top of his chest. So eventually what's going to happen is your rib cage cannot sustain so much pressure, so it's literally going to collapse and crush your entire torso. So the man would be suffocated to death. And now, so this would be a very slow process, and as it would be going, it would be very painful because slowly ribs would bruise, then break, and then you would be looking at puncturing of lungs, and eventually the entire torso would be crushed under the weight of the stones. Now this man, Giles Corey, was 70 years old when he underwent this. And this is actual fact that he went through this process. Now Giles Corey was a very stubborn man, but he also was on his second wife by the time he married Martha Corey, and he had a full family at this time, and his sons had already taken over part of his property. One of the rules about witchcraft and these laws was that if you were convicted of witchcraft, or you refused to answer to the crime of witchcraft, pleading guilty or not guilty, that could result in you losing your property. And he did not want his children, his sons, to lose their property. So he refused to answer whether he was guilty or not guilty. And so they started this pressing where they kept asking him to answer. And he ended up saying something, okay? This is actual court documents. And they asked his last words, and they just told him to answer. And his last words were, "More weight." He refused to give in to their demands. And so he was kind of, a little bit savage. So, ways to prove somebody is a witch. Okay, one of these ways was the swimming test. And you might as well call it the drowning test. During this time, anyone who was different, who was from a warmer climate, who would know how to swim, okay, was seen as someone who was different. And because of that, if you threw somebody into the water and they were able to swim and not drown, then it was proved that they were in fact a witch, and they would be taken out of the water and then convicted of witchcraft, and by doing so they would be sentenced to death. Another thing that was done were witches' marks. They would take and humiliate these oftentimes women, and what they would do is they would strip these women down in public, and they would search their bodies for any type of what could be a deformity, okay, Could have been a birthmark, could be a mole, anything that they saw as different, a tattoo. Any of these different things could be called a witch's mark and could be said to be proof. Another thing that was done is the prayer test, where they would ask a individual who was accused of witchcraft to recite their prayers. Now, under intense scrutiny and knowing that if you screwed up, you could be sentenced to death, and under intense stress, many people failed this because they were required to memorize all these different tests, but it was such a huge undertaking to have to do this under so much stress. Another thing would be incantations, how someone would react to the incantations being read, or if they were able to read these incantations, which were often in a different language. And if they read them correctly, it was assumed that the individual was a witch because they could read Latin. Another thing that was done was the scratch or prick test. And this would be done, and they would find we would look at one of these witches' marks, and they would take a needle, and they would scratch or prick one of these areas on the individual's body. And if it did not bleed and the person did not react to pain, then that was said that was where the devil literally touched them and burned away their sensation. Now, there were terrible people out there who went about and falsely accused and falsely identified people through this scratch and prick test with a sleight of hand, where they would show a very sharp needle and show a very sharp blade, showing how sharp it was, and then they would go to test the individual, and then they would switch that blade or that needle out for a very dull one, so it would not cause the individual to feel pain or to bleed because it was dull. Another thing done was the touch test, where they would have the victim, and the victim was often the person who was also the accuser, would come forward and would come up to the person that they accused of being a witch, and they would have this victim touch the witch or have the witch touch them, and if this individual fell under some type of spell, would start screaming or crying or showing any type of pain, that would be proof that the individual was a witch. Another thing that was done was witch's cake, and this is one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard. What they would do is they would take the urine of the accused person, and they would bake it into a very plain cake, and then they would feed the cake to a dog, and then if the dog acted in a certain manner, that was proof that the individual was a witch. Now, conviction, if you were convicted of witchcraft, it meant your death. In some areas, this meant that you were burned to death. However, in Puritan times, death was by hanging. Okay, they were not burned at the stake. However, yes, that was often a common thing done in Europe, that witches were burned at the stake. Admitting to your guilt meant that you spent time in prison or jail. So if you look at it this way, if you say that you are innocent and you're convicted, you're going to die. However, if you admit to being guilty, you'll spend time in prison or jail, and you'll lose your property, but you'll have your life. So this was a hard task that many people had to choose between. Do I say that I'm guilty and save my life, or do I say that I'm not guilty and by chance end up being convicted of witchcraft? Trials were based mostly on witness accounts. Anyone could be accused. Feuds or fights between two people, usually neighbors, led to accusations of witchcraft. So it could be something as simple as you want a particular piece of land that you share a border between, and you have a fight over this particular piece of land, and it might result in accusations of witchcraft, sadly. And we're going to see that within the crucible happening. Reasons for the accusations and convictions. Frontier war. At this time, okay, this was a frontier area where everything past where they had developed was considered a frontier, and it was undeveloped. That meant something like there were many disputes with the Native Americans, because as we know, the individuals who came to America treated the Americas like a land that did not have any people on it. And so when they were settlers, they just took over plots of land that actually already did belong to the Native American peoples. Another thing was economic conditions. Everyone was very poor. Okay, they only had, it was just barely above subsistence lifestyle. Congregational strife. Okay, this is literally, a congregation is the group of people that attend a church together, and there were two different leaders that two different groups supported, and it ended up dividing the congregation. Teenage boredom. Remember that these children, okay, these young people are supposed to be treated like adults. So they had chores and things that they had to be doing all the time. They never had much freedom. And so there was so much boredom that was associated with that. And so they may have created drama for themselves. And then personal jealousies. Remember how I mentioned the land disputes? It could be something along those things. It could be something else in regarding two individuals who just did not get along for whatever reasons. Two young girls started the process, which resulted in mass hysteria. Mass hysteria is a phenomenon when a huge group of people undergo a sort of insanity in a group. A mass hysteria